The morning of July 17th in the year of our Lord 1576 dawned with an eerie stillness over the Villa Medici di Poggio a Caiano, nestled among the rolling hills of Tuscany. The light filtered through shuttered windows, casting long shadows across marble floors where footsteps had fallen silent. In the grand bedchamber of this opulent estate, beneath silk canopies and surrounded by the finest tapestries gold could buy, lay the motionless form of a woman who had once been the brightest star in the constellation of Italian nobility. Eleonora de Garcia di Toledo, Grand Duchess of Tuscany, lay upon her bed as still as the marble statues that graced the villa's countless corridors. At 33 years of age, she possessed a beauty that had once made poets weep and ambassadors stumble over their words. Her dark hair, lustrous as a raven's wing, now spread across silk pillows like spilled ink. Those eyes, once described as deep as Mediterranean nights, stared sightlessly at the painted ceiling above, where cherubs frolicked in eternal spring, mocking the winter that had settled forever upon her heart. The silence that enveloped the villa was not the peaceful quiet of morning rest, but something far more sinister. It was the silence of secrets, of whispered prayers, of servants who dared not speak above a murmur. For what had transpired within these walls would send shock waves through the courts of Renaissance Europe, reverberating from the Vatican to the palaces of Spain, from the merchant halls of Venice to the scholarly circles of Paris. But to understand the full horror of what occurred in that chamber, we must turn back the pages of time, back to when a young woman's fate was sealed not by love, but by the cold calculations of political alliance. We must journey back 16 years, to a time when Italy basked in the golden light of the Renaissance, yet harbored shadows darker than any medieval dungeon. The year was 1560, and Italy pulsed with the rhythm of unprecedented artistic achievement. Michelangelo's divine hand had blessed the Sistine Chapel with immortal beauty. Humanist philosophers proclaimed the dignity of man from university halls. Yet beneath this veneer of civilization, the Italian princes ruled with a cruelty that would have made ancient tyrants blush. It was a world where power was absolute, where a man's word was law, and where women, no matter how noble their blood, remained property to be bartered and controlled. Francesco de' Medici, heir to Florence's most powerful dynasty, embodied all the contradictions of his age. Born in 1541 into a world of silk and marble, surrounded by the greatest art treasures of the world, he had grown to manhood, believing himself divinely appointed to rule over lesser mortals. His education had been impeccable, his tutors the finest scholars money could procure. He spoke Latin like a priest, discussed philosophy with the fluency of a university master, and could compose verse that would not shame a professional poet. Yet beneath this cultured exterior lurked a temperament as volatile as Mount Vesuvius. Francesco's jealousy burned with an intensity that consumed rational thought. His need for control was pathological, his capacity for violence legendary, even among his violent contemporaries. Those who knew him well whispered that he viewed people not as human beings, but as objects to be possessed, controlled, and discarded at will. At 19 years of age, Francesco's destiny became intertwined with that of a 17-year-old girl who had never seen Florence, never imagined that her name would be whispered in fear and pity for centuries to come. Eleonora de Garcia di Toledo was the daughter of Pedro de Toledo, the Spanish viceroy whose iron rule over Naples had made him one of the most feared and respected men in the Mediterranean. She had been raised in the sophisticated court of Naples, where Spanish grandeur mingled with Italian elegance, where she had learned to speak 4 languages, to play the lute with the skill of a master, and to carry herself with the poise that marked true nobility. When the marriage negotiations began, Eleonora had no voice in the matter. Such was the way of the world. Her beauty was catalogued like a merchant's inventory. Her olive dark eyes, her graceful bearing, her quick intelligence that would make her a suitable companion for intellectual discourse. Her substantial dowry and her father's political connections made her an ideal bride for the Medici heir. That she was a human being with her own hopes, dreams, and desires was considered irrelevant. The journey from Naples to Florence in the autumn of 1560 was a procession of almost imperial magnificence. Eleonora traveled in a gilded carriage surrounded by an armed escort, her trousseau following in a dozen wagons laden with silks, jewels, and tapestries. As she crossed the Tuscan countryside, peasants emerged from their fields to catch a glimpse of the future Grand Duchess, blessing themselves and calling out prayers for her happiness. If only they had known what fate awaited her, perhaps their prayers would have been for her deliverance instead. The wedding celebration at the Palazzo Pitti was a spectacle worthy of the gods themselves. For 7 days and 7 nights, Florence became a stage for the most elaborate festivities Europe had witnessed in a generation. Nobles arrived from every corner of Italy, their retinues glittering with silk and gold. The wine flowed like rivers, the music never ceased, and the air itself seemed perfumed with possibility. Eleonora, dressed in a gown that cost more than most men would earn in a lifetime, moved through the celebrations like a goddess descended from Mount Olympus. Her beauty was so striking that conversations paused when she entered a room, and even the most jaded courtiers found themselves struck speechless by her presence. She smiled graciously, danced with ethereal grace, and spoke with such intelligence and wit that veteran diplomats declared her the most remarkable woman they had ever encountered. But even as the celebrations reached their crescendo, observant guests noticed something troubling in Francesco's behavior. His eyes never left his bride, following her every movement with an intensity that seemed to burn. When other men spoke to her, even in the most innocent circumstances, his jaw would tighten and his hands would clench into fists. During the wedding feast, he insisted that she sit so close to him that she could barely move, his arm around her chair like a golden shackle. The first years of marriage passed in a blur of public appearances and private suffocation. Francesco transformed their palatial home into a beautiful prison, with Eleonora as its most treasured captive. She could not leave the palace without an armed escort. She could not receive visitors without supervision. She could not even speak to male servants without a lady-in-waiting present to observe and report every word. The Duke had justified each restriction as necessary for her safety, for her honor, for the dignity of the Medici name. But those who knew them both understood the truth. Francesco was slowly strangling his wife's spirit with golden chains. Eleonora endured this claustrophobic existence with remarkable dignity. She bore Francesco 4 children, each birth celebrated throughout Tuscany as a blessing upon their house. She fulfilled her duties as Grand Duchess with grace and intelligence, presiding over court ceremonies, patronizing artists and scholars, and maintaining the appearance of a happy marriage that fooled even the most sophisticated observers. But beneath the surface of this gilded cage, a desperate rebellion was growing. In the gardens of the Palazzo Pitti, during those brief moments when her guards relaxed their vigilance, Eleonora would walk alone among the flowers and dream of freedom. She would touch the stone walls and wonder if other women had felt as trapped, as desperate, as utterly alone, despite being surrounded by hundreds of servants. The year 1573 brought a change that would prove fatal to them all. His name was Pietro Bonaventura, a young poet and courtier who had recently arrived in Florence from Rome. Where Francesco was dark and brooding, Pietro was fair and gentle. Where Francesco spoke in commands, Pietro asked questions. Where Francesco demanded obedience, Pietro offered respect. At 25 years of age, he possessed the kind of refined intelligence that made him welcome in the most sophisticated circles, yet he remained humble enough to treat a servant with the same courtesy he showed to a duke. Their first meeting was entirely innocent. A chance encounter in the palace library, where Eleonora had gone to select books for her private reading. Pietro was examining a manuscript of Dante's poetry, his face reflecting the kind of thoughtful contemplation that had become foreign to Eleonora's world. When she approached, he did not bow and scrape as others did, but simply smiled and asked her opinion of the verses he was reading. For the first time in years, Eleonora found herself engaged in genuine conversation with a man who seemed to see her as a person rather than a possession. They discussed literature, philosophy, and art with the passion of true scholars. Pietro's eyes lit up when she offered an insight, and he responded to her thoughts with the kind of intellectual respect she had forgotten existed. When they parted that day, Eleonora felt something she had not experienced since her girlhood, the simple joy of being understood. What began as innocent conversations about literature gradually evolved into something far more dangerous. Pietro began to appear wherever Eleonora walked in the palace gardens, always with a book in hand, always ready to discuss some finer point of poetry or philosophy. They would sit on marble benches beneath ancient olive trees, their voices low and their heads bent together over verses that seemed to speak directly to their hearts. Slowly, carefully, Pietro began to reveal his true feelings. He wrote sonnets that celebrated not just her beauty, but her intelligence, her wit, her courage, in enduring a situation that would have broken a lesser woman. He spoke of love not as possession, but as liberation, not as imprisonment, but as the freedom to be truly oneself. For Eleonora, who had forgotten what it meant to be valued for her mind rather than her womb, Pietro's words were like water to a woman dying of thirst. For 3 years, they maintained their secret romance with the skill of master spies. They developed elaborate codes for their correspondence, using classical references that would mean nothing to casual observers, but spoke volumes to educated hearts. They created ingenious methods of meeting, utilizing the vast network of passages and gardens that honeycombed the Palazzo Pitti. They even began to plan an escape that would allow them to flee to France, where Eleonora's distant relatives might offer protection from Francesco's inevitable fury. But in their careful discretion, they underestimated the depths of Francesco's paranoia. The Duke had long suspected that his wife's spirit remained unbroken, despite years of careful control. He had noticed the new light in her eyes, the way she moved with renewed grace, the subtle changes in her demeanor that suggested inner happiness. Like a skilled hunter, he began to set traps, using servants, ladies-in-waiting, and even palace guards as his instruments of surveillance. The betrayal came from someone Eleonora had trusted completely. Her lady-in-waiting, Caterina di Montecroce, had served her faithfully for over a decade, had shared her secrets, her fears, and her dreams. But Francesco's gold proved stronger than loyalty, and Caterina's reports to the Duke became increasingly detailed and damning. She recorded every glance, every whispered word, every moment when Eleonora's face betrayed emotions that had nothing to do with her marriage to Francesco. The discovery of the romance came in the early days of 1576, when Caterina delivered to Francesco a collection of Pietro's love letters that she had stolen from Eleonora's private chambers. As the Duke read these passionate declarations of love, these promises of escape and freedom, his fury built like a gathering storm. The young poet had not merely seduced his wife, he had dared to imagine a future where she might be free of Francesco's control. This was not just adultery, it was revolution. Pietro Bonaventura was arrested at midnight on a cold February evening, dragged from his chambers by Francesco's personal guards and taken to the dungeons beneath the Palazzo Pitti. What followed was 3 days of interrogation so brutal that even the hardened torturers commented on the Duke's personal involvement in the proceedings. Francesco wanted to know every detail of the romance, every kiss, every whispered endearment, every moment of happiness that had been stolen from his control. The young poet endured agony that would have broken stronger men, but his love for Eleonora gave him strength beyond his years. He revealed nothing that would increase her danger, admitting only to his own feelings while insisting that she had remained faithful to her marriage vows. His loyalty to her, even in the face of death, only increased Francesco's rage. On the third night, Pietro Bonaventura was executed in secret, his body thrown into the Arno River without ceremony or Christian burial. For Eleonora, Francesco reserved a punishment that would be both more elaborate and more symbolic. Since she had used her mouth to kiss another man, since she had spoken words of love to a traitor, it would be precisely her mouth that would suffer the ultimate penalty. But the Duke's revenge required careful planning, a stage worthy of the drama he intended to enact. The Via Medici di Poggio a Caiano was chosen for its isolation and its dark history. Built by Lorenzo the Magnificent as a pleasure palace, it had witnessed more than its share of intrigue and violence over the decades. More importantly, it was far enough from Florence to ensure complete privacy, yet close enough to the city to allow for easy disposal of evidence. On the 15th of July, Francesco approached his wife with a manner so charming and conciliatory that Eleonora allowed herself to hope that her husband had somehow found forgiveness in his heart. He spoke of rebuilding their marriage, of taking time away from the pressures of court life to rediscover the love they had once shared. His voice was gentle, his eyes soft with what appeared to be genuine remorse. When he suggested a romantic retreat to the villa, Eleonora saw it as a miracle of renewed affection. The journey to the villa was almost pleasant, with Francesco maintaining his pose of loving reconciliation. They traveled in a single carriage, sharing wine and reminiscing about the early days of their marriage. Eleonora began to relax for the first time in months, believing that perhaps her husband's love was stronger than his jealousy, that perhaps their marriage could be saved after all. The villa was almost deserted when they arrived, with only a handful of servants whom Francesco had personally selected for their absolute loyalty. These men had served the Medici family for generations, their silence purchased with gold and insured by fear. They knew better than to question their master's commands, no matter how strange or disturbing those orders might be. During their final dinner together, Francesco maintained his facade of reconciliation with masterful skill. He spoke of their children, of plans for the future, of improvements he wanted to make to their various properties. He even apologized for his jealousy, admitting that he had been too possessive, too controlling. Eleonora's relief was so profound that she found herself laughing for the first time in months, her face radiant with hope for their future together. But when they retired to their chambers, Francesco's mask finally slipped. From a hidden compartment in his traveling chest, he produced Pietro's love letters, each one a dagger thrust into Eleonora's heart. The papers rustled like autumn leaves as he spread them across the bed, his voice taking on a tone of cruel satisfaction as he forced his wife to read aloud every word of love that had been written to her. The realization of her true situation struck Eleonora like a physical blow. She understood now that Pietro was dead, that her correspondence had been discovered, that she was alone with a man whose capacity for cruelty exceeded even her darkest imaginings. When she tried to speak, to explain, to beg for mercy, Francesco's response was a smile that would have chilled the blood of angels. What happened next remains shrouded in the mists of history, passed down through generations of Florentine whispers, impossible to verify, yet too persistent to dismiss. The servants who were present took Francesco's gold and carried his secrets to their graves. The official records speak only of a sudden illness, a fever that claimed the Grand Duchess in the prime of her life. But the stories that circulated in taverns and marketplaces, in servants' quarters and ladies' chambers, tell a far more sinister tale. According to these accounts, which persist to this day despite their horrific nature, Francesco ordered his servants to restrain his wife while he personally prepared the instruments of her final punishment. The Duke had consulted with professional torturers to devise a method of execution that would be both physically devastating and symbolically perfect. Since Eleonora had used her mouth to betray him, it would be her mouth that would become the instrument of her death. The whispered stories claim that Francesco personally sewed his wife's lips together with silk thread, stitch by careful stitch, while she remained conscious and aware. The punishment was designed to be both practical and symbolic, physically silencing the woman who had dared to speak words of love to another man while condemning her to a slow death by suffocation. If these dark legends contain any truth, Eleonora would have died sometime during the dawn hours of July 17th, after enduring hours of unimaginable agony. The folkloric accounts describe Francesco as remaining in the chamber throughout the night, watching his wife's final struggles while obsessively repeating phrases about silence, betrayal, and the proper punishment for unfaithful women. These details, however, remain forever in the realm of legend, impossible to verify through any reliable historical documentation. What we know with certainty is that the morning of July 17th brought the discovery of Eleonora's death. Francesco summoned physicians from Florence who certified that the Grand Duchess had died of a sudden fever during the night. The funeral was conducted with all the pomp and ceremony due to a member of the Medici family, but the suspicious circumstances of her death immediately generated speculation among those who knew the couple's troubled history. The rumors began almost immediately. Servants whispered about muffled screams heard during the night, about the expression of frozen horror on Eleonora's face, about strange marks around her mouth that cosmetics had attempted to conceal. Palace guards spoke of unusual orders they had received, of rooms that were to remain locked, of questions that were not to be asked. Gradually, the truth about the assassination began to spread through Florence, transforming Francesco de' Medici from a figure of respect into a symbol of Renaissance masculine cruelty. The psychological impact of his crime began to destroy Francesco almost immediately. Consumed by guilt and paranoia, he became increasingly reclusive and violent. He saw conspiracies everywhere, trusted no one, and lived in constant fear of divine retribution. His remaining years were marked by erratic behavior, sudden rages, and a growing isolation from the world of politics and culture that had once defined his existence. Francesco remarried the following year to Bianca Capello, his longtime mistress, but the new marriage was marked by mutual distrust and constant fear. Bianca knew what her husband was capable of, and she lived in terror that she might someday provoke the same fury that had destroyed Eleonora. Francesco, meanwhile, suspected that his new wife might attempt to poison him in revenge for his constant threats and domestic violence. The Duke's fears proved prophetic. In 1587, only 11 years after murdering Eleonora, Francesco de' Medici died mysteriously at his villa in Poggio a Caiano, the same location where he had committed his most heinous crime. Many suspected that Bianca had finally found the courage to poison her husband, but ironically, she died on the same day, possibly killed by Francesco's brothers in retaliation for her suspected crime. The story of Eleonora de Garzia di Toledo became one of the darkest legends of the Italian Renaissance, a tale whispered in palace corridors and servant halls across Europe. Her death represented the ultimate corruption of power, the transformation of love into possession, of marriage into murder. The most macabre details of her execution, including the alleged sewing of her mouth, remain impossible to prove, but they possess a symbolic power that transcends historical fact. In the centuries that followed, the Via Medici di Poggio a Caiano became a place of dark reputation. Local peasants claimed to hear muffled moans echoing through the countryside on July nights, and the property changed hands several times as owners found themselves unable to forget the shadow of the horrific crime that had been committed within its walls. Even today, few tourists who visit the various Medici properties know Eleonora's story, and her tomb in the family crypt bears no mention of the circumstances of her death. Yet among scholars of Renaissance history, Eleonora de Garzia di Toledo remains a tragic symbol of how absolute power can corrupt even the most basic human emotions. Her story reveals the dark underbelly of an age we remember for its artistic achievements and intellectual breakthroughs, reminding us that behind the beauty and sophistication of Renaissance culture lay abysses of cruelty that challenge our understanding of human nature. The legend of the Grand Duchess, who may have had her mouth sewn shut by her own husband, serves as an eternal warning about the dangers of unchecked power and the vulnerability of women in societies where they are viewed as property rather than people. It is a story that resonates across the centuries, speaking to every age that has struggled with the balance between love and control, between protection and imprisonment, between the desire to possess and the need to respect human dignity. Ultimately, Eleonora de Garzia di Toledo paid with her life for the crime of seeking genuine love in a world of arranged marriages and political alliances. Her death stands as a dark monument to the consequences of jealousy unleashed, of masculine honor valued above human life, of a society that permitted such atrocities to be committed in the name of marriage and family honor. Her story reminds us that the Renaissance, for all its glory, was also an age when domestic violence, combined with unlimited power, could produce acts of barbarity that echo through the centuries, forever staining the memory of those who committed them and those who suffered beneath their terrible weight. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please like and subscribe for more content.